The start of 2020 in China has been stormier than the final days of Brangelina or the relationship between Donald Trump and Rosie O'Donnell. News of the economic downturn that has seen the country record its lowest economic growth rate since 1990 has been compounded by the terrible impact of the coronavirus, events that naturally we will be following and keeping you updated about right here on VisualPolitik. However, on this occasion, we're going to tell you about another major threat facing the Chinese superpower, a threat that could completely change the expectations that many of you have about the geopolitical evolution of this country. No doubt you've heard of the one-child policy. Well, that same policy, which was once hailed as a vital and unavoidable measure for achieving development, has been completely abandoned as it has created a situation that now threatens China's role as a global superpower. And as you will see, for any country to maintain its population without taking into account any migratory movement, a fertility rate of at least 2.1 children per woman is necessary. That's what is known as the replacement rate. However, the average number of children had by Chinese women is only 1.6, and the birth rate has fallen from about 20 births per 1,000 citizens in 1990 to just over 10 in 2019. Or in other words, the Chinese today are having half as many children as they had just 20 years ago. At first glance, all of this may seem unimportant. However, the truth is that the consequences of this trend could be enormous, especially in the field of international geopolitics. That's why, in 2015, the Chinese government put an end to the one-child policy, and now they need more children like there's no tomorrow. But what's really going on? What happens to the one-child policy? Why the sudden turnaround? And what does all this have to do with China's future?
The Great Demographic Glitch.
Every time politicians play at designing, shaping, and building societies at will, it's a bit of cannon fodder for VisualPolitik. The results, they're often pretty dire. The one-child policy went from being a relief to becoming an extremely heavy burden. But to better understand where the problem really lies, we have to go back to the middle of the 20th century. At that time, the Asian giant had not yet completed its demographic transition. That is, women still had to have a lot of children to compensate for very high mortality rates. Basically, it was the typical scenario of any pre-industrial society. As a country modernizes, mortality rates fall much faster than birth rates, therefore creating huge population growth. It is precisely that gap, that difference between the fall in the birth rate, which happens very slowly, and the fall in mortality that explains the great demographic shifts of the last century and is, for example, what is currently happening in many African countries. But there was something else going on in China. Mao's government actively controlled the country's birth rate. The fundamental idea went something like this. Available labor was what caused economic growth, so the more workers the country has, the more development the country would achieve. The idea was severely tested in the early 1960s when the Great Famine cost the lives of more than 15 million people. The famine was a result of the so-called Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong's second five-year plan. After such a demographic catastrophe, the aim of the government was to promote birth rates at all costs. So, through a variety of measures, the population increased by almost 400 million people in just 30 years. And that's the point when communist leaders thought that the birth rate had got out of control and that if such population growth continued, China would never achieve development because the population was growing as much or more than the resources needed to maintain it. That's why in 1979, the Chinese government decided to take a stand and say, okay, we've reached a breaking point. We have a population well above our means, so now everybody will be limited to having one child, and if you have more, you're going to have problems. And that's how the one-child policy came in, which remained in force until 2015. Only in some rural areas and in specific cases was it permitted to have more than one child. But it is a policy that has had unexpected consequences. It is estimated that during the time the policy was in force, it ended the lives of more than 360 million fetuses and newborn children. The reason? On one hand, avoiding the sanctions imposed by the government for breaking the law, and on the other hand, the cultural preference that existed in China for having boys over girls. In fact, this cultural phenomenon increased the ratio of male to female in some regions to 125 men for every 100 women. It's the most uneven ratio on the planet. In short, atrocities were committed that have been harshly criticized by human rights organizations. The one-child policy became the most extensive social engineering operation ever carried out. As you can imagine, after almost 4 decades of strict adherence to this policy, the consequences are enormous. They have left a deep impact on the social structure of the country. So let's take a look.
China's numbers make no sense.
The experts are clear.
China should have stopped the policy 28 years ago. Now it's too late. Yi Fuxian, senior scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
But why does this scientist claim that it is too late? Too late for what? Well, take a look at the following chart. What you can see is simply a radical change in China's demographic structure, a radical change that begins with a devastating loss of population. This is the scenario the country is going to face for decades to come. While the number of children under the age of 14 will drop considerably, the population aged 65 or over will balloon over the next few decades. And that's not all. Even more critically, the working age population is expected to gradually shrink by about 200 million people, 200 million fewer workers over the next 30 years. And by the end of the century, things could be much worse. In fact, according to China's own National Bureau of Statistics, the working age population began declining in 2012, and in 2019 alone, it shrank by nearly 900,000 people. To give you an idea, this is how the demographic pyramid is changing. It's a bit like what's going to happen in countries like Singapore, Japan, or South Korea. With one important difference: China is going to face this problem before it's a fully developed country. And of course, with a dwindling working population and an increasingly dependent aging population, well, it won't take long for problems to appear.
China's state pension fund to run dry by 2035 as workforce shrinks due to effects of one-child policy, says study, South China Morning Post.
And the problems don't end there. All the economic parameters may be affected. For example, until now, much of China's economic growth has come from incorporating more and more workers into the productive economy. However, now that is changing, and there are already many analysts pointing to this fact as being one of the causes of its economic slowdown. To top it off, China is a country that is still developing, which means it has to try and grow rapidly while facing all these problems. And that is not going to be an easy task. Look, for example, at how things might be in just 30 years. By 2050, the dependent population is expected to be 80% of the working age population. That means there will be 4 dependent citizens for every 5 workers in China. But we don't have to go that far into the future. A study of 323 companies in Sichuan, one of China's most populous provinces, has found the astonishing fact that nearly 58% of companies struggle to fill vacant positions due to worker shortages. Perhaps this is why we should not be surprised that China is now the world leader in industrial automation. It currently has more than 150,000 industrial robots in service, approximately 36% of all the industrial robots in the world. In this way, the Beijing regime hopes to increase employee productivity, that is, to maintain or increase production with fewer workers so that a good standard of living can be maintained for its population. And take note, because it's not the only country that sees robots as a way of escaping its demographic woes. It is exactly the same escape route that is being pursued by South Korea, Japan, and virtually every developed country. Faced with rapidly aging populations, only very strong productivity growth can alleviate the serious economic and social consequences of having a disproportionately elderly population. The question that begs to be asked at this point is, apart from robots, is there a solution from a demographic perspective? What exactly does the Chinese government intend to do?
When the damage is already done.
When the damage is done, reversing it is very difficult. So many years of social engineering have made the Chinese population apathetic towards starting families. And not only that, the country's specialization in productive industries is not helping either. Let me explain. China has grown very fast over the past few decades, but continues to maintain relatively low levels of productivity. This indicates that the country is specialized in competing with low labor costs in labor-intensive industries. To give you an idea, productivity per employee in the United States is nearly 5 times higher than it is in China. That is to say, for every hour worked, it takes 5 Chinese workers to produce the equivalent of what it takes 1 American worker. This also meant that shifts of 12 hours or more are not uncommon in China.
China needs to change its economic development model from labor-intensive and low-quality product production to the production of high-quality goods. Dong Xiaochu, Deputy Director of the Institute for China and Global Development, Faculty of Economics and Business of the University of Hong Kong.
The fact is, faced with such a labor-intensive working environment, having children isn't so easy to squeeze in. So in a way, these two factors, the gradually developed lack of enthusiasm for families coupled with the intense work environment, are making the abolishment of the one-child policy, well, essentially useless. And this is what explains repercussions like these. Several Chinese provinces are restricting abortions when, until recently, they openly promoted them. Some have even implemented the need for 3 doctors' signatures to be collected before being able to carry out the abortion. What's more, there are also obstacles appearing which are making divorce more difficult. So will the Chinese government be able to force families to have more children? Perhaps they will give privileges depending on the number of children, or restrict access to public services or jobs if the condition of having at least 2 children is not met. Well, pay attention, because that's where this situation is likely to end up. The loss of a working-age population is an issue that can harm not only China's economic development, but also its geopolitical ambitions. So now, at this point, it's your turn. Would you be in favor of a government that forced its citizens to have more children? How do you think China's demographic crisis should be solved? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. Do subscribe for brand new videos. Do check out our friends at Reconsider Media who provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.